my background really is in clinical psychology, but I had a real interest in sports psychology, primarily because that was my entry into college. I was a high school swimmer, pretty competitive, a coach, and burned out pretty fast. I was swimming about, in high school, close to 10,000 yards a day in 2 days, and I was pretty tired of it by the time I got to college. But anyway, after graduate school, I got really fortunate to snag an internship at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, and that's where I really began to learn a lot about working at the elite level with athletes. But my passion has always been to work with kids. I coach swimming, I coach soccer in the ABYSA League here in Buncombe County. And Warren Wilson, I work with student athletes where very few of them are on scholarship. They're there for the passion. They pursue high goals as well as any Division I or Olympic athlete that I've seen. So I thought I would talk just about some interesting things that I've seen recently, as Steve was saying, in kind of the national trend in youth sports, and then really try to make it interactive with you all to see what questions that you have about really anything related to sports psychology. There's a lot of talk about developing mental toughness and character through sport and competitiveness. So I want to just give you some insights from my experience and research on some of this. Usually we have questions at the end, right? So I thought I'd start you off with questions. These might be some things that you would wonder about. As a parent of kids that play sports, these are the things that I wonder about and I often spend some time thinking about and researching. Right, so the first is, what's the right balance to strike when it comes to supporting and coaching my child athlete? How much should we push? And how much should I just step back and let the process happen? Number two, what really motivates our children in sports? Three, how do I help my child athlete compete without getting too uptight? This is the number one reason that I'm called. I do a lot of consulting long distance, and it's almost always about that. And number four, what mindset is most helpful for my children in their development as athletes? So we're going to talk about some of these things, and hopefully I'll answer some of those. But I think a better title than that boring youth sports psychology is this: A Tale of Two Approaches. The New York Times had two very different articles this month about youth sports, and I don't know if you can see the bottom or if the tables are in the way. But the first one is just from last week: committing to play for a college, then starting 9th grade. Did y'all happen to see that article? This is very interesting. This is a 9th grader in a room with, I can't tell if that's Justin Bieber's dad or one of those.
Yeah, that one.
You know, playing in her room, in her little girl room. She's already committed and signed a scholarship for University of Texas to play soccer. And this is Michaela Schifrin. If you haven't heard of her yet, you certainly will. She's in this week's Sports Illustrated. She's the up-and-coming downhill skier star who will probably replace all the media attention that Lindsey Vonn was going to get, who got injured. And they're two very different approaches, I think, to how to develop talent. And it's a really interesting question that I think we face is, when you see talented kids, and you have your own talented kids, is how do you develop that? What's the most effective way to do that? And it's a question that drives a lot of my work. I'm also really interested in learning about, when you see people develop their talent, how do you then apply that in other areas of your life as well? So to your own life and achievement, as a psychologist, for me, if I'm working with patients, how can I apply that with my own patients? I certainly try to apply it to my own life as a parent and coach and teacher. Let's look at these two approaches and then kind of let you all decide what seems to work better. So this is the first one on that article, committing to play for a college then starting 9th grade. And really, this is the approach that says we're looking for the outcome. We're looking for excellence. We're looking for how can we advance our kids to a point that they do get a scholarship or they do win a lot of games. And so it typically is talked about in terms of specialization, so kids specializing early. This is what happened to me when I was a kid. I was approached, I swam for the Houston, I forget what the name of the club was, but then when I was approached by the Houston Dads Club, which was a really, really big swim program that was kind of pre-Olympic. I was 7 years old, and I loved playing every sport, so I turned it down, probably with the assistance of my parents, I suspect. I don't think I would have had enough knowledge to know what was before me. But that allowed me to be good at a lot of sports, pretty good at swimming, but certainly not to the Olympic level. So I kind of took this path that steered me away from that. But a lot of kids, of course, are specializing early, and the emphasis often becomes on developing those talents to be able to be recognized early. What's also seeming to happen, if you've read this article, and I really recommend reading it if you haven't seen it, is that the system has begun to kind of flip so that now, instead of recruiting, normally you would recruit, if you're a college coach, you would recruit an athlete after their junior year. And technically, you can't really even contact them till after their junior year, or somewhere in the summer of their junior year. But they've all figured out ways around this, and there's loopholes in these rules, so that you can contact a kid through their club coach or their travel team coach, and just let the coach know, hey, we're interested in your daughter, we're interested in your son. Then that child can then start contacting the coach. And this is pretty much what happened with they profiled this one girl, Haley Bird, who's from Florida. And she talks about basically being on email or the phone every single night of her 8th grade year with coaches from A&M, University of Colorado, University of Texas. And this is a picture of a assistant coach at a D1 university, University of South Carolina, who's at one of those junior tournaments, 8th and 9th grade. So the article really is about kind of the professionalization of youth sport. And I'm really interested as a psychologist in terms of how does that affect kids' development, both physically and also athletically. So this is a quote from the article that says that a growing body of academic studies has suggested that this sort of specialization, focusing on one sport, can take a toll on young bodies, leading to higher rates of injury. So you're talking about somebody practicing a tremendous amount of hours using kind of the same sets of muscles and so forth. For many parents, though, the biggest worry is the psychological pressure falling on adolescents. And that's what I know more about. And it really is this kind of outcome focus that we see that emphasizes winning and competing at high levels over almost anything else, over character development, etc. So this is, I looked at my Twitter feed this morning and picked up on this guy, Tim Grover. I don't know if anybody has heard of him. He's a pretty well-known trainer for the NBA, and he's written a book recently called Relentless. And it's about his training of Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and Dwayne Wade and all these superstars. So it's a really, really popular book. And I just looked at his quotes and I thought, this is just perfect. This is exactly, it just happened to be, I saw it this morning. No one will remember how hard you tried, they'll remember what you achieved. Give them something to remember, #relentless. You don't get promotions and raises for your inner drive and passion alone, you get them from delivering results. Relentless. Right? So there's a really strong emphasis on outcome here. He clearly gets results. I mean, he's trained the best in the world. But I would say that there's a small percentage of athletes that can respond to that type of pressure. And probably a small percentage of us that can respond to that pressure that says, it's not about our inner drive, it's not about our passion, it's about always delivering and getting results. I know that would make me awfully nervous if every one of my lectures or what was being evaluated and I could see everybody like checklisting and so forth, rather than about the process that I'm engaging in. Like when Steve asked me to give this talk, I was really excited because it's been a while since I've talked about youth sport. I usually talk about elite athletes. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about it, but it was fun. It was the process. and hopefully the outcome will be okay. But I'm really concerned about this emphasis and what happens to kids developmentally with that. So I'll just give you some of the information I have. I love this picture. This is one of the first athletes I ever worked with, and his hair is just beautiful, representing the early 90s. This is Todd Swoap, whom I first met when he was 17 years old at the Olympic Training Center. He was from Maryland, and he moved to Colorado Springs to train full-time to try to make the Olympics. And his first goal was to make the '92 Olympic team that went to Barcelona. The problem for Todd was that he was the child prodigy of two national champion table tennis players, Dale and Connie Swoap. And it was an inordinate amount of pressure on him. And when I met him, that was pretty much what he wanted to talk about. He didn't want to talk about visualization. He didn't want to talk about goal setting. He wanted to talk about how can I live up to the expectations of my parents. And I said, well, what are they like? Are they supportive? Oh yeah, they're very supportive. And I said, well, what do they do when you play in a tournament? And he said, well, if I make a mistake and I look over, I pretty much see them doing this. And I said, well, that's probably not very helpful for you, is it? He said, no, that really distracts me. And so we did some techniques to help him learn how to focus, and I had him draw a little dot on his racket, kind of like tennis players would, you kind of refocus in between points. But the biggest thing that he came to me with was that this overemphasis on winning for him had burned him out. And this was a kid that was a really good tennis player, table tennis player. And he pushed through, and he went to the Olympic trials in I guess it would have been early '92, and he didn't qualify. So I kept talking to him, and at one point he said, Bob, I'm just tired of it. I just don't want to do it. What should I do? How do I push through this? And I said, well, why don't you take a break? Why don't you just take some time off? This is obviously not your passion anymore. You're feeling really pushed for it. So that's what he did. He took a break of about 6 to 8 months. And then he came back, and he had this kind of renewed passion. And he began to make it about himself and about his own goals and about driving towards the next chance, which would be the home Olympics in Atlanta in '96. Well, sure enough, he was able to make that team in the 2000 team. So he's a two-time Olympian. And of course, the U.S. kind of doesn't do well on the international scene in table tennis. Maybe y'all know that. But making the Olympic squad was really such a highlight for him. But it wasn't, he had set the goal, the outcome goal, but it was the process for him that became much more manageable. It was about how to make table tennis fun again for himself. And when the focus is on outcome, for example, I'm going to get a scholarship for playing really well, and we're going to emphasize winning and developing. When that becomes the exclusive focus, there's some costs that come along with that. Of course, there's the amount of pressure that happens, and then there's the burnout. The thing that I think is interesting is that the number one thing that people talk to me about is, and this is usually I get contacted by a parent first, is about a high school kid, sometimes middle school, who says, my child is always performing worse in competition than in practice. I don't know if any of y'all have kids that experience that they're much more comfortable in a practice setting, but when they get into a competition setting, they tighten up. I can't blame them, because the message that they're getting from the Tim Grovers of the world and kind of our athletic culture, not necessarily any one specific culture, but just the overall culture, I think in U.S. youth sports is not really necessarily a win at all costs mentality, but that winning an outcome is super high priority. And there can be kind of some lip service to character development and team development, but when you see the focus on let's look at the W's, that's what counts. And I'm working with some teams right now where they're getting pressure from their athletic director. The athletic director is saying, it's about winning now. We've put a lot of money into this program, and you've got to produce. So is there anything wrong with that? Well, maybe not from the athletics director's perspective, because that's what he or she is seeing, is like that's how they get measured as well. The problem, I think, is that there's a different way to get those wins and a different way to achieve success than putting all the pressure on that as kind of that number, that win-loss record, or how quickly are you going to drop your So I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about approach number 2. And it's not that approach number 1 doesn't work. It's just that it comes with a lot of cost to it. And there's another way to get there, I think, that I hope maybe most of you all are already kind of amenable to. This is Michaela Schifrin, who last year won the World Cup slalom at age 17, the youngest to ever do this. So the New York Times article on her is really an interview with her mother and father about how did you develop that talent? And because clearly she had this talent and this passion early on. Now, she was like Todd in that both of her parents were also great athletes. They were both ski racers. Her dad skied, I think, for Dartmouth, and her mom was a great master skier. So she had a lot of kind of opportunities, which you have to have, and a lot of excitement around it. But here's the question that her mom, Eileen, got asked about how did she get so good. And she says, there's no exact answer how Michaela got good. Well, she had to shovel cow manure for weeks with me when we were replacing our lawn one summer. It was 90 degrees and she was 10 years old and she worked so hard without complaining. So she's a good ski racer because she did all kinds of different developmental things like learning a good work ethic. But none of them were part of a plan to make a world champion. So this article really gets into the fact that the parents didn't start off thinking about how do I get her on this, how do I get her onto this trajectory towards becoming a world champion.
Currently down, and we are working to get it back online for you as soon as possible. Our internet service is down, and we will do everything we can to get it back up as soon as possible. Thank you.
Her dad says, her father, Jeff, recalled, these top-level coaches would tell me that Michaela was just ripping up her race scores, and I would say, yeah, I agree, but she's just 9 years old, and they'd say, what are your plans for her? And I'd answer, plans? Well, tomorrow she's trying out for a part as the angel in the Christmas play. So both her mother and father in this article go on to say that, you know, a lot of this was this inner drive in Michaela, but that they focused on the process of developing skills, the process of mastery rather than the outcome of races. So every decision that was made about her training, all those decisions were built around the daily process of mastering skills, skill development, which Michaela loved. And this is something that we as coaches and parents can really do, which is if we put that first, skill development, mastery of skills, we can still develop that passion. So Michaela truly believed that the focus should be on the process of getting better and not race results. She does that to this day. Everyone on the World Cup says they want to race like they practice, but how many actually do it? Michaela can because she's not thinking about trying to win, she's thinking about getting better. So when she was young, the story goes, and in this Sports Illustrated, this week's Sports Illustrated, she talks about this too, is that she would bypass races so that she could do more repetitions, more practice repetitions on her home hill. That's a really different attitude, right? You got a big race coming up and you say, you know what, instead I think I would do better to focus on a particular skill that I'm working on. And what she's really, really good at is her form now. There's nobody in the world that has the type of form she has as a slalom skier as an 18-year-old. Usually slalom skiers and women skiing are significantly older because it takes a lot of time to develop that type of form. So clearly she's got some natural talent, right? But it's been shaped by this process where she works over and over and over on skill development and doesn't think of the outcome of the race at all. Does it mean she doesn't want to win? Of course not. Of course she wants to win. But that's not what she's thinking about. She's thinking about how do I get better on a daily basis. She does that through visualization. She watches the best racers in the world and then she sees herself doing that. She tries to emulate their form. And now at this point, others I'm sure are emulating her form. So what's some of the data behind this? I can just tell you a little bit about some research that I've done over the past couple of years. I'm working on kind of a book that is looking at how do elite athletes reach excellence in their own sports. What are the factors that are involved with that? It's a qualitative research study instead of quantitative, so I'm not giving them surveys about how they feel here and there and how many hours they're practicing, but it's more interviews looking at what do they say is what has gotten them to their peak. So I'm going to just tell you real quickly about two people, and then hopefully they'll give some time for some questions. And these are both people that I've had the chance to talk with this year, actually 2013. This is Lynn Cox on the left, and then Billy Mills is on the right. Billy Mills is in his 70s now. That's from actually 50 years ago now, 1964. So tell you a little bit about both of them and how they work towards their excellence. So Lynn Cox is probably the greatest athlete that y'all have never heard of. Anybody heard of Lynn Cox? Yeah, a couple of you. This is a little bit of a resume. She's a long distance cold water swimmer, extreme swimmer basically. When she was 15, she set a goal, kind of an outcome goal, to cross the English Channel, and she wanted to break the men's and women's record, which she did at age 15. And then she did it again the next year. And then she started setting all these goals to swim in these kind of bizarre places that most of us wouldn't want to swim in. The Cook Strait in between the North and South Island of New Zealand, very cold, rough water. The Strait of Magellan, Cape of Good Hope, the Bering Strait, and then to cap it off when she was in her 40s to swim in the Antarctica. She ended up swimming over a mile in about 25 minutes. And this is water that if you or I drop into it, we pretty much sink pretty quickly. I know from experience, I'm a swimmer, and a couple summers ago I tried to swim in Lake Superior. This was not a good plan. That water temperature is usually around 40, and I couldn't move. Like, I had not acclimated myself at all to that. I just thought, oh, this will be fun. It's a warm, sunny August day, but the water was just... And my wife started laughing at me as I began to sink, and I was like, this is actually not funny. I actually need help. I've been known to jump into cold water and get into trouble. But Lynn has this astounding ability, and she's just a wonderful person to speak with, and she and I have talked about 6 times over the last year, to not only withstand that cold water, but kind of to thrive in it. Like, she sees it as a challenge, and it's not typically well publicized. Like, most of you don't know of her achievements. Probably a lot more of you have heard of Diana Nyad, who swam across the Florida Strait between Cuba and that was no small feat either. But that water temperature is in the 70s. So when she swam here, this is Disco Bay, which is a great name. That water temperature is about 27 degrees. And the reason it's not frozen is because it's salt and it's got currents. It also has very large marine predators in it. So she's got kind of a different mindset, right? But think about being out in the middle of the open ocean. When she was 14, she swam Catalina Channel, which is between the Catalina Island and the California coast, which is about 21 miles, where huge fish, sharks reside. Huge tankers go through that channel. A lot of fog. She's just got this mentality of I'm going to take on whatever challenge is in front of me. But the only way she does it, and this is the secret to her success, and it turns out it's the secret to almost every athlete that I've talked with, is about how she stays in the present. So I'll tell you a quick story about that. This was probably one of her most challenging swims, and it wasn't even that long of a swim. The distance between the North and the South Island here in New Zealand is about 10 miles. A good swimmer should be able to do that in about 4 to 5 hours with really good conditions. But it usually looks like this. And on the day she did it, the white caps were more like 3 to 6 feet. It was 2 storms had converged. But she wasn't going to give up. She had set this goal to cross it. She would be the first woman to cross it. This was in 1975. There had been 3 men that had ever swum across this strait. There had been no women. So she gets into the water. It's in the 50s. She knows what's in front of her. Now she has a team of support, right? She's got a boat going along with her, and they have spear guns and stuff like that for the sharks. She does not wear a wetsuit. She wears a cap, a swimsuit. She wears no flippers or anything. This is just getting in the water and swimming. So she gets in and she estimates that it's going to take her about 4 to 5 hours. Well, about 5 hours in, she feels like the South Island looks further than when she started. And the boat crew has been alongside her and encouraging her, but she's actually been going backwards because of the current. So what do y'all do at that point? You say, you tap the boat, you're like, I'm done, I'm a little cold, I'm not getting anywhere. Well, the strength of Lynn, and the thing that I try to teach my own students and kids and athletes, is that if you can stay right there in that moment and not think about that far goal, the outcome, and stay in the process, then you may be able to manage it. So this is what she said in her interview with me. So she says, yeah, I looked at the map, it's 10 miles, it'll take me 4 hours. I asked how close to shore we were, and they said I was still 5 hours away. She says, I learned then you can't predetermine the amount of time you're going to swim before you take off. It's very much like life. You start on shore and you finish on shore, but you don't know when you're going to finish. Keep going and adapting to whatever the conditions are, and draw strength from the people who are encouraging you. Really motivational, right? So how did she actually do it? So she's in there and she's going to give up. And one of her boat crew members says, listen, Lynn, all of New Zealand is listening in right now on New Zealand radio. This is before live updates on tweet or Facebook updates. So she gets a burst of energy there, and she's able to kind of get outside of that current that's been pushing her back and start that swim. And she begins to make progress. Then at some point she feels these very large animals underneath of her. And so she's swimming like this. She's pretty freaked out. And then they break the surface, and it's a pod of 40 dolphins. And these dolphins basically accompany her, as you've maybe heard stories of dolphins staying with humans. She didn't ride them or grab them or anything. It would have been cheating, and they wouldn't have let her do that. But they pretty much guided her the whole way. And she got to the end of her swim in 12 hours, in a swim that was supposed to take 4 to 5 hours. So we talk about that as what? Grit or resilience. And to me, this is something that can be developed. This is something that I like to work on developing with kids and athletes, is that to imagine that grit and resilience is something that just resides as a character trait, I think is incorrect. I do believe that there are kids that show more of this early than other kids. But I do think it's something that can be trained. And Lynn was a really good example of that, because she talked about what her mentality was as she would approach all of her swims. She was tested in all sorts of labs because people said, how can she do this? How can she swim in this cold water and not go into hypothermia? It turns out that when she goes into cold water, for some reason, her body core temperature actually rises. She has well-distributed body fat, for one thing. But also, there's something about her mentality that allows herself to stay calm and not freak out, which is usually what makes us a lot colder. So she was tested in a London lab one time where she was competing against all these really strong men. And the task was to sink your arm into ice cold water. Has anybody ever done that? Like, it's not fun. It's a stressor. It makes your heart rate go up. You have a sympathetic nervous system response. And usually you've got to pull your arm out pretty fast. So the goal was, could anybody keep their arm in for 10 minutes? So she puts her arm in, all the guys, and they're all screaming and cussing. And she's watching the clock. And she tells herself, with every minute, she says, it's going to get better. And then at each minute, she's like, no, this still really, really hurts. Well, it's going to get better. But she breaks down the 10 minutes into these series of 1-minute blocks that she can handle. And she can tolerate the pain for 1 minute. And she said it always hurt the entire time. It never felt better. And it's the same thing when she swam in the Antarctica. She wrote about it in a great book called Swimming to Antarctica. She said it was not fun. It hurt. But at some point, you go numb. But you got to figure out how can you still move your arms. And it's super impressive to hear her speak about that. The other person that I really was fortunate to speak with is Billy Mills, who's the only American to have ever won the Olympics in the 10,000 meter. This is a brutal race in track and field. It's 25 laps around the 400 meter track. It's dominated by the Africans. and it's a middle to long distance run. And when he came onto the scene in the early 60s, he was not known. He grew up on the poorest reservation in the United States, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and lost his mom and dad both before he was 12 years old. So he was orphaned, he was raised by his grandparents. He experienced a tremendous amount of discrimination growing up. He did get a scholarship at the University of Kansas. He was a talented runner. He used his athletics to kind of get out of his situation and cope with all the stress that he had. But in his junior year, he was feeling like nobody really cared about him, even though he was a pretty good runner. And he was suicidal. And he was standing at the edge of a 5th floor window on a chair getting ready to jump out. And at that point, he tells the story, and he told me last year that he heard his father's voice, his dead father's voice, saying, "Don't do this." Billy's a very spiritual man. And so he said he stepped down, and as he stepped down, he went to his running journal. I don't know if this is true. It's a great story, but he did tell me this. He said he stepped down and he wrote in his journal, 1964 Olympic champion, gold, 10,000 meters. And this was around 1960, something like that. Just a phenomenal change in terms of attitude. Now that sounds completely like outcome goal setting, which it is. So then he had to figure out, how do I get from here, 1960 to 1964? He was not all that, I mean, he was a great runner, but he certainly wasn't world class at that point. So what he did was he spent every single day visualizing how he was going to do that race. And there was a guy that was the world champion at that time from Australia. His name was Ron Clark. And what all Billy did was picture himself running with him the entire race. So eventually he does this visualization 12 times a day, 20 times a day, and he begins to build up his endurance, his speed, runs all these international races, and starts kind of moving up. He qualifies for the Olympics. He goes to Tokyo, which is where it's held in 1964. Nobody knows who he is. He's not expected to do anything. He goes out and he does exactly that race plan. And the way he told it is that he just broke that 10,000 into a series of 400s, repeat 400s if you've ever had any track workouts, right? And they're just one after the other. So he goes through the 5,000, which is halfway in the race, faster or as close to as fast as he's ever run a 5K, right? But he still has 5,000 to go. So how's he feeling? Is he happy? He's like dead tired. He's almost cooked. But he's had that goal. He's had that visualization. So he gets back to the process again, and this is the point that I'm trying to make, is that when we think about the outcome, when we think about, am I going to make this 4-foot putt, or I've got 4 holes to go, and I've got a 5-stroke lead, how do I protect that lead? You ever see that happen in golf, right, where people begin to fall apart over those last 4 holes? There's lots of stories out there. Remember Greg Norman in '86. You begin to think about the outcome, and it changes your whole way that you experience your sport. And this is what can happen to our kids too, is they think about winning, or they think about what do my parents think, or my coaches think, or what do my classmates think. And that's when the choking happens. And that's when the pressure builds up so much that they can't handle it. So Billy turns back and he says, okay, let's go back lap by lap by lap. And the other thing that he said was that he had brought his wife over. At that time they didn't pay for it, so they had to save all sorts of money for her to come over. And the Emperor of Japan was in the stands, Emperor Hirohito from Japan. And so he said he played a little game, which was that the Emperor was on one side of the stadium and his wife was on the other side of the stadium. And he would say, okay, I'm just going to get to the other side and then I'll drop out there because I'm so exhausted. And then he'd get to this side and say, I can't drop out in front of my wife. Well, I'll go over to Emperor Hirohito. He'd get over here, I can't drop, that would be a disgrace. So he took these last 3,000, 4,000 and broke it down into these manageable 200s. And that's, I think, a really great lesson for us, is that when we're looking at these long seasons, or even like a long high school career, is that you look at setting goals that are daily, and that are about the process, and they're about mastering skills rather than about outcome. So when you have time, or if we have time, I can show it to you. You should Google the Billy Mills finish of the 10,000 meter race. It's one of the most exciting races in history. He does win. He stays with Ron Clark the whole way, and with 2 laps to go, Ron Clark looks back, and at that point, Billy Mills knows, wow, he's scared. And on paper, Billy Mills is 2 minutes slower than Ron Clark, which is a lot in a 10,000. So he had to make up about 1.5 to 2 minutes in this race. It's just a phenomenal story. Billy viewed running for himself as a spiritual journey. It was really about healing for him. He had lost his parents. He had been discriminated against. And he valued it as a growth process for him. And he never, besides setting the goal of winning the Olympics, it was much more about how he could create autonomy in his own life. This was a guy that had very little control over his own life, and how he developed that. And how he reached excellence using positive self-talk and visualization, which he engaged in all the time. And this is something that kids, I think, are not very skilled in, is positive self-talk. Are y'all's kids good at that? Typically, most kids, when they're not doing well, berate themselves, even if you're being supportive. You're like, don't be so hard on yourself. Kids are really, really hard on themselves. And so you can talk to them about maybe this story in terms of how positive self-talk helps so much. We have a counselor at our school, Ann Lundblad. Y'all know Ann? She's a world-class ultramarathoner. She's won world championships. She's a social worker, and she works in our counseling center. But a couple of years ago, I think she set the record for the 100-mile race. And this was on a 1-mile track. Imagine how boring that would be. So she's at like lap 33, which is she's already run a marathon. And she still has 2/3 of the race to go. She's sick, she's vomiting. She's like, what am I doing out here? Which is what most of us would say. And her husband, Mark, reminded her that her goal was to finish this race and to do well. Just run the next lap. It's the same thing. And people say, well, what do you think about while you're running those long, long distances? And she said, running. Right? She's not like singing songs or thinking about solving our marital issues or solving the world's climate change. You know, she's thinking about running. And that's a really good lesson too, as we get right in the mix of it. Okay, so as kind of a summary, what do elite athletes do, and what can we do in youth sports? How do we get this process focus, which I hope I'm convincing you is the other pathway to excellence than focusing on just the winning? Is we adopt a growth mindset, and this was what elite athletes do. What is possible, and how do we view setbacks in competitions? So when you've got a setback, what do you say to yourself? Katie Spotts was a student at Warren Wilson College, and she set a goal to row across the Atlantic Ocean solo. And she did that a few years ago. She was in the middle of the ocean, exhausted, hallucinating. It's really difficult to do this because you're not getting very much sleep. And so the same thing occurred to her, as like, why am I doing this? And then she remembered she had raised all sorts of money for clean drinking water, and so around the world. And so that helped renew her focus. And so she did that kind of corny thing where you've got 1,500 miles to go. You all have done this, right? Okay. 1,500 miles. And instead of saying, I've got 1,500 miles to get to South America, she said, I've got 1,500 1-mile rows, right? So I'm going to do 1 mile. I'm going to do the next mile. Her story is fascinating, too, because she gets really close to the South American shore, and she encounters these humongous waves. And she can't land. Like her boat's going to get swamped. And so her team says, well, we're going to come out and get you. And she said, no, you're not. She's been out there for 62 days. So instead of giving up and letting the team kind of bring her in those last 2 miles, she rode another 8 days out of her way north, 400 miles, so that she could land in a different spot. Right? So that's grit, that's perseverance, that's resilience, and it's a skill that's developed. Now, she has a lot of passion inside her that I think there's obviously some genetic aspect to that, but there's also a tremendous amount of parental influence there. She talks about her parents as basically giving her the green light on anything she said she ever wanted to do. Before that, she swam the length of the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, something like 300, something like that. But many of us in sports don't adopt this growth mindset. We adopt rather a fixed mindset, which says that talent is something in us. And this is a big product of the media and the focus on talented players and development of talent. And it's really a myth that we've got this fixed amount of talent. All the studies that we show that even if you've got genetics working for you, there's an entire field of molecular biology called epigenetics, which is about how the environment intersects with your genetic profile. And so teaching kids early on about resilience and how to bounce back, I think, is something that we can give them as coaches, as teachers, as parents. How do we view competitions? Do your children view competitions as threats or opportunities? Right? It's the same competition, but there's so many athletes I work with. I work a lot with runners who will toe the line, and they're thinking about, you know, I hope I don't choke. Right? They're seeing what's in front of them as something really scary, rather than this opportunity. So that's something that we can work on. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Hopefully our children are focused on the fun aspects. If sports are not fun, and this is the #1 reason kids give for playing sports, is because it's fun. If they are focusing on extrinsic motivation, to please you, to please their coaches, to get a scholarship, you will see that they will experience more pressure with that. Some kids can handle that, but many kids have a hard time with that pressure. I already said this. Become a master of the daily process in pursuit of long-term goals. And this is something that's called grit. And if you want to watch a great TED Talk, watch the TED Talk on Grit by Angela Duckworth, who just won a MacArthur Genius Award. She's a psychologist, 43, who talks about how to develop grit, and that it's a skill rather than an innate trait. Elite athletes seek and welcome feedback on skill development. And this is something I think we want to work with our kids, is that when they finish an event, is that they should be thrilled to run to you to ask, what did I do well? What could I have done better? And that it's about developing that process. There's a technique that maybe some of you have read about called deliberate practice, which is associated with the kind of the buzzword of 10,000 hours towards becoming an expert in anything that Malcolm Gladwell kind of made so popular. Well, it turns out that the 10,000 hours is not the key, it's how you do the practicing. And it's deliberate practice in which one is specifically looking for feedback, and you're working on your weaknesses. So I'll look at the swim coach now because I'm a master's level swimmer. So I'm an IMer. I'm really good at butterfly. I'm really good at backstroke. I'm average at freestyle, and I'm pretty bad at breaststroke. So guess what I need to work on in swimming? Breaststroke. Guess how few sets of breaststroke I do? Well, that's what's going to keep me from being an elite master swimmer, because I hate breaststroke. It's slow. My kick is terrible. Right? But you hear my mindset. Like, it's not working. Like, I'm not working on the thing that I really need to work on, which is my weakness. It's fun for our kids to work on the things that they're really good at, right? So, coaches, have your kids work on weaknesses because they see that as fun and getting better at that. That's part of deliberate practice and being really open to that. And finally, all this has to be done in teams and connections. So much of what kids participate in sports about is for the social. And when we minimize that or don't recognize how important that is to their psychological development, we miss a huge opportunity. So there should be a tremendous amount that goes into team building. So if I'm given the opportunity and I've got a team I'm working with, I'll bring them to the challenge course at Warren Wilson, which is a low and high ropes course, to actually build team trust, build connections, build a lot of fun into it. Because so much of the time when they're practicing, I'm thinking about like a D1 basketball team, Division I basketball team. Those practices, if you've ever watched them, are really, really intense. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of just intense focus. And you still have to remember these are 19-year-old kids. They're late adolescents. and we expect them to do so much. I think if we flip it and we said, all right, let's look at how we can make practice as fun as it can be while we're developing skills. And it doesn't mean that you're not giving feedback, because the most effective coach knows when you give feedback, you give it immediately. You don't hem and haw about it. Forget about this kind of sandwich approach of, you got to say positive and then a negative and then a positive. It's just like, you just tell them what they did wrong and move on to the next thing. Say, here's what you do better. All in this kind of supportive atmosphere. And it's not tied into, well, this is what's going to make you start, or this is what's going to make you go on the travel team. This is how you're going to get better today. And that's what I ask my athletes. If an athlete comes to me and says, hey, I want to make the 2016 Summer Olympic team, I said, that's fantastic, awesome goal. What are you doing today? What? You know, so it's what you do on a daily basis, and I'm sure y'all are highly aware of that. But this is something that I've interviewed a lot of elite athletes, and that really turns out to be the key for them, is being able to have these long-term goals, but spend all of their time mentally in the present moment. And so Michaela Schifrin, there's this nice article in Sports Illustrated this week. I'll just read you this last thing and then we'll stop. They say in Michaela, the Schifrins were not trying to build an Olympian. They were trying to raise a healthy, strong skier with a love of the sport. They got both. The goal was always to work towards mastery, says Jeff. Race results were important, but they weren't the overarching goal. From early in her career, Michaela would skip races to train, maximizing her repetitions. So I think that's a good place to stop, because I've been talking now for too long, it looks like. And I'm just going to open up for some questions. Yeah.
And this is for Steve too, really.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit off subject, but it's the bottom line. We can talk and educate about this till we're blue in the face. But I feel like what these ideas are up against is the all-powerful dollar. And an obvious thing to me that this school could do is have a situation where the teachers are the coaches. So we don't have any. How do we combat and go about defeating this all-powerful money thing that is being controlled by a few people? I mean, it's a typical problem that's not just in that we see here, but of course in our country and everywhere.
So are you talking about like that youth sports is driven towards trying to achieve success that's then rewarded with scholarships, or?
Well, there's many reasons why specifically here the dollar is important. I mean, good sports teams bring in students, and I mean, there's a lot of good things that are happening.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
Right, but you lose sight of the integrity of what we're really trying to do at an educational institution. I
mean, my opinion is that you market what you're strong in. And if you're strong in character development, and you're strong in participatory athletics, and your kids are joyful and they're developing skills, then people will want that. And the people that want their kids to be on high, powerful travel teams and so forth will do that. They'll do that outside of the school, and they're welcome to do that. But within the school itself, if the mission, and I read y'all's athletic mission, is really about participation, and it's about skill development and character development, is you market that, and why even hide that? And say that, you know, every kid that plays the sport can get better, without exception. And every kid that plays the sport should be able to be supported in that, and should be able to experience a lot of fun. Now, what if you've got a team where there's like really, really kind of aggressive, hyper-competitive kids, and kids that are not so competitive, right? That's fine. There's learning opportunities there. How can you help these kids that are super competitive be good leaders? How can they take that and turn that towards helping the kids come along, rather than seeing them as like slowing their team down? That's what I would say. That's how I'd respond to that.
The table tennis guy, Sparrows, is that who it was?
Todd Swears, yeah.
After his Olympic event or successes,
Yeah.
what did he go on to do?
He went on to get his undergraduate degree in business, and he works for some accounting firm in Maryland, and he teaches and plays masters table tennis, and he can still beat pretty much everybody. He's amazing. I had Todd and Sean O'Neill, who went to the '88-92 Olympics, come to Warren Wilson one time to do were you there that day? And do a demo. I had him come in to talk about sports psychology, but we put him in the gym, and they just did this fantastic ping pong demo. Kids absolutely loved it.
How about the runner? Billy Mills. Yeah, Mills after that.
Billy Mills, well, he ended up having a foundation, and that's where he spends all of his time. And it's called, I can't remember the name of it. Sorry, but it's something along the lines of Running Brave. And it's basically to help American Indian children develop and come out of poverty through sports. He's put a lot back into his own community. Super nice guy. I could barely get him off the phone now. He just wanted to talk and talk and talk. And that's the other thing that was really cool about this is these elite athletes were really willing to share a lot of their stories. I've had a blast in this.
I was wondering, what's your opinion of, in terms of helping a young athlete develop, the kind of the overreaching media coverage of sports, and I'm talking about it's not working down from the game. You've got ESPN coverage
Right.
of NFL Combine. You've got
Right.
continual running reels of high school basketball athletes, their highlight reels, just bombarding them on the internet. And they're drawn to this.
Sure.
The developing player is. And it's, how do you reconcile that? Would you encourage more? It can be self-defeating. I mean, just a steady diet of this.
Yeah.
When you're trying to grow them naturally.
I think it is. I think it is a little defeating, that steady diet. If it's within your power to influence your child not to spend as much time looking at that type of hype, that's great. But as you said, they can be drawn to that. I think it contributes to this idea that you need to be a superstar, that you need to stand out to be able to make ESPN highlight tapes and so forth. But remember, very few of our kids are going to make those highlights. And that you can encourage them that they're going to make a highlight film by the very fact that they're not interested in making a highlight film, right? They're focused on getting better every day instead of this kind of narcissistic posting. Like I see a number of athletes do that. They'll post every single one of their workouts on Twitter. Hey, I'm going to hit the gym today. Hashtag working hard, getting it done. And I think it's really narcissistic. And I think there's a lot of insecurity in that. I think people are doing that to say, look, I'm doing this even though I'm not in the NBA. And I think if they spend a little less time on that Twitter feed and a little bit more time working on their left-hand dribble skills, they'd actually probably do a little bit better.
When you work with athletes who get injured, what kind of counseling do you give them? Where are they? They're losing time.
Right. So what I do is figure out how can they take that and turn it into an opportunity. And so when you have an injury and you can't do as much physical workout, that gives you more time for mental workout. So like when Ann Lundblad, the distance runner, gets hurt, which is frequently, she'll do a lot of pool workouts. But while she's doing the pool workout, she's actually doing a lot of visualization. And so she's as mentally tough as they come. The other thing is if your kid gets hurt, is encourage them to continue to go to the games and the practices and be a part of the team. How can they can actually be an example and show that they're not hanging their head even though they really want to play, and do everything they can to make their teammates better. A lot of times when you get kids to start kind of getting out of themselves and think about how can I make my teammates better, they get better themselves kind of incidentally. Coach K talks a tremendous amount of this at Duke, where he talks about, you'll know about the fist. He talks about, you ever see him coach, he's always doing this on the sideline. It's a particular defensive play. but it's also a symbol that 5, it's really easy to break 5, right? Individual players, but when you go like this, you're much more powerful. So with injured players, he does the same thing. It's like, you've got to be able to be a part of this team, you've got to be a part of this fest. And so you don't leave them behind. One of the troubles for skiers, for example, on the World Cup is they'll be skiing in Austria and get hurt, and then they'll be flown back to Vail, where their surgeon is, and all of a sudden they lose all their team support. So there's a danger of depression that happens pretty quickly. So you give them a lot of support to somehow stay connected with their team. Yeah.
A couple of things. First of all, you start talking Duke, you lose the attention of all the Tar Heel fans in the room.
Right. Sorry.
And it's interesting, we don't have swimming practice today, so I'm going to try to find a farm and take the kids out to shovel cow manure.
Yes,
So
good plan.
that's what we got next. So the thing I want to ask about, and for the parents who are on the swim team, I've got swimmers here, I'm not talking about your kids, I swear. What's your opinion about, and I was a single sport athlete. I swam from the time I was like 6.
Right.
What do you think about that, specialization versus the kids out there who are trying to do the multi-sports? And I suppose the multi-sports are really the kids who are trying to do more than one sport at as high a level as possible versus the kids like the high school kids, we call the 3-sport athletes.
Right.
The kid who's doing track, swimming, cross country, that sort of thing. I mean,
Right.
so what are your thoughts on those sorts of things?
Well, I think it takes the kind of the rare athlete that's going to be a triple sport athlete and excel at all of them. I mean, the quarterback for the Seahawks is a good example. Yeah, well, you have baseball, football, and what's his other sport?
Yeah, but if he couldn't hit here in Asheville,
Well,
come on.
but still, I mean, he's a professional at multiple levels. But I do think that it's not that common for somebody to be top level in all this. So at some point, yeah, I think specialization begins to work. I think we tend to specialize a little early. And, baseball's a good example of kids, talking about kids getting injured, is specializing in pitching, for example, when you're 8, 9 years old and you're throwing the ball way too hard for your rotator cuff and your elbow. And so I think you set that kid up for injury and disappointment. And I've seen that a lot. I also just think it's fun to be good at a lot of things. And at some point, when you start seeing yourself saying, well, I'm really excelling at swimming and I really want to do that more, then you can begin to drop this. But I don't think that that's something that the parents or the coaches should enforce on the kid. I think the kid should have that choice. That's just my opinion. Now, I also think, Michaela Schifrin's a pretty good example. She spent most of her time skiing, but they did tons of different things to help her with. She wasn't always on skiing. She was, according to the article, she was spending a lot of time unicycling to develop her balance. And I thought, wow, that really makes a lot of sense. When you're skiing slalom, you're half of the time you're like this. So, yeah, I think to me, I think I would let that take care of itself, if you will. It's like let the specialization, when the kid lets you know she's ready for that. I don't know if that helps.
I have a follow-up on that.
Yeah.
You stole my question.
Yeah.
You read a little bit and it says that multi-sport athletes become better athletes just because they train with a lot of different muscles.
Right.
And it's good for them. And then you compete on some of them, and you hear, I've talked to some of the college coaches, and you say, at what age? At what age do you decide where you want to go? And you see, you go and compete in one sport, and you're playing against kids who are doing nothing but that sport.
Right.
You compete in another sport, you're doing nothing against kids competing in that sport. So
Right.
at some point, you have a kid who is, good overall athlete,
Right.
following behind all of them. And then if you have a kid who has a goal of playing a collegiate sport,
Right.
I'm in the dilemma, at what age is too young, at what age is too old, and I have 3 and I'm kind of experienced
That's a great
with all
question.
3, and so it's as a parent, it's hard to, what, do you have any
So that's a great question, and I don't think there is any answer to that about when to do that. I mean, my observation is that it's happening earlier and earlier. I don't think that anybody would argue with that. People are beginning to specialize earlier. I think that trend is probably not good for our kids. I think that as we see, they're more likely to get injured because of overuse in a particular set of muscles. And I also think that you risk burnout. I also think that you set kids up for that if they specialize, say you start to have them specialize in 6th or 7th grade, you're like, okay, we're only focusing on soccer now. You kind of give them the expectation that now they have to earn that scholarship, which I think is unfair to them, right? I mean, maybe they earn it, maybe they don't. But I'm just a pretty big fan of empowering the child to have some of those decisions about what do they like to do? What's the most fun for them? And I think there's a tremendous amount of crossover learning. If you're playing 3 sports, you're still developing all sorts of sports relevant skills for even the sport that you may ultimately specialize in. The problem is, as a parent, I think we get up this idea of keeping up with the Joneses and saying, oh, so-and-so is specializing and they're doing all the travel team and they're doing all this and that and we're falling behind. And then you've got colleges that are now scouting 8th graders.
Oh, no, 6th graders.
And 6th graders.
Yeah.
And almost everybody argues that that's a really kind of a screwy system. But we're in that system now, and so I would imagine that as a parent, if you're interested in getting your kid in a scholarship at a really high-level program, that's going to be a difficult conundrum for you to be in. If you don't really care as much about that, I would definitely say let the child take the lead on that. But, you know, I mean, for my kids to be able to go to Duke, the only way they're going there is if one of them grows about 7 or 8 inches pretty soon, you know, or if somehow they develop in some way that we're not doing that, because we just let them play whatever the heck they want to play. So they're in chess club, they're in math club, sometimes they play ABISA, sometimes they play basketball, and they're going to be good at a lot of things, but they're probably not going to be great at anything. In terms of at that level of reaching the scholarship. So if it's your goal to have your kid reach a scholarship, at some point, yeah, you're going to get some specialization. But I don't know that it necessarily has to be early. I think that kids can absolutely develop very, very quickly once they specialize, even as late as 9th, 10th grade. That's my opinion. Because I think a lot of it really is the approach that they take, the mental side, is how they think about themselves, how they bounce back from setbacks, how they bounce back from injuries, what kind of support they're getting around their competition and their participation. Yeah.
Although I'm uncomfortable with the comparison, I'd argue that if shoveling manure is good for skiers, basketball might also be good for golfers. My real question. My real question is so.
Some tension here.
Just recruiting. My real question is, so if it might be a good idea to step back away from the competitive events in order to develop skills, what's a better model for the elite travel teams who are so focused on getting kids, even 8th graders at exposure events and, you know, younger kids at really high level competitive regional national tournaments?
Yeah. So what's a better model for
those clubs? I mean, assuming that approach 2 is perhaps a more thorough, perhaps even better model for developing high-level athletes.
Right.
How should elite clubs take that advice into consideration?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know that they will take that advice,
Sure.
because the system is pretty strong now for as you said, exposure.
Mm-hmm.
And scouts are coming to the big tournaments. If elite clubs as a group made a decision that we were going to stop doing that, you could stop it. You could just say, you know, we're going to work way more on skill development within our elite clubs, and we're not going to travel as far, and we're not going to do these big national tournaments. But that would have to be a nationwide decision. And I do actually think, though, that it would be better, because And think about the amount of time that they're spending in the car that they could be spending actually developing skill. So there's that in and of itself is the tremendous amount of wear and tear on the kids in the travel and the difficulty with keeping up with their schoolwork and their friendships. I mean, they can't be in drama club probably if they're on the road all the time because they're missing play practice. You know, to me that just seems like a relatively narrow development focus. And that feels like that we're kind of jumping into this idea that this is the only way to do it. I don't know how any one school bucks that trend, like Carolina Day or any other school. I think to kind of pull yourself out of that, you know, you're going to stand out. And there's going to be some people that say, hey, this doesn't work for me. I really want my kids to have the most exposure. I guess another way to look at it is if individual clubs made that decision to focus on developing all of the skills, mental toughness, injury rehabilitation, deliberate practice, instead of doing all that travel, is people might then start coming to that team and saying, you're doing something really well here, and we really, really like your model. So you don't need to go and travel to all these tournaments. We'll just come and watch you because we think you're developing really well-rounded and also high achieving players.
Thanks.
I think it's going to take a while for that to happen because I think we're going the other direction.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Just as parents, as fans, supporting your kids in
Yeah.
sports, what are the top 5 things that you can say and do to support your child, like after they've played well or played poorly?
Yeah.
You know, or
That's great.
are there
Great.
certain things that you should never say?
Well, the woman that does.
And I mean,
Yeah.
it's common sense to some people, but
No. There's actually good research on this, and a lot of it comes out of Stanford. A woman named Carol Dweck who studies mindset. She's been in the news a lot, but she's studied this for years and years and years. And the short summary is that we've been doing it wrong. We've been telling our kids how great they are, and we've been inadvertently adopting the fixed mindset, so that when a kid does well in a game, you say, you were just so awesome. You were such a great player. And what they hear is that it's about them as a person, and it's about like this inherent talent. And what that does is it sets them up for, oh my God, I've got to protect this. I've got to protect that I'm this good. So what Carol Dweck recommends pretty routinely is to not use those types of phrases about how good your kid is, what kind of talent they have, but instead talk about the effort that they put in, talk about the attitude that they showed, talk about their sportsmanship. Good or bad game, doesn't matter. Now, lots of kids, when they realize they've had a bad game, if they come over to you and you're like, oh, great game, you played so great out, they know you're lying, right? They know they didn't play well, so that doesn't really help them. They just end up not hearing it. But you can still talk about, hey, honey, I know that was a difficult game for you, but I noticed in that one play that you didn't give up. That really showed a lot of grit. And then stop. That's the other thing is, 5 things is, one thing is say that, and the other 4 is just stop talking. We talk way too much to our kids when they're playing. You know, even though, for example, in ABYSA soccer, you know, there's all these rules for parents to be quiet. I mean, y'all have gone to those games. They're not quiet. Parents are, not only are they screaming encouragement, but they're telling their kids what to do on every single play. Well, coaches shouldn't be doing that either. Right? You teach the kids and then you let them play, because if you've got a growth mindset, the kids learn better when they see themselves communicating with themselves on the field. You watch good coaches and they're quiet on the side. And then they watch what's happening, and then when there's a timeout, they talk to their players. But coaches that are on the sideline, I see this in basketball a lot, talking about every single move. Where do you need to be? What is that kid learning? Not to trust herself. She only can move depending on what the coach is saying. Have you ever seen your players get confused out there because they're hearing too many things at the same time? Ooh, it's awful.
I just wanted to say, you were talking about Rachel Stafford.
Who?
Didn't you just say Rachel Stafford had done all this research?
No, Carol Webb.
Oh, at Stanford, maybe that's
At
what you're saying.
Stanford.
Okay, anyway, well, there's an article that came out in the new, I think it was, anyway, what's the big New York, you
New
just
Yorker,
said it.
New York Times?
Yeah, the New York Times, I can't think, anyway, in September, and this lady said the best thing to say to your kids during any sporting event is, I love to watch you play.
Yeah, that's a great article. I saw that.
And that's all you say.
Yeah, yeah.
I love to see you swim. I love to see what you did.
Yeah.
I love to watch you play, and nothing else.
Yeah.
And so I have this article on here. That's what I was just trying to.
It's a great article. I agree with that, and I think that's an awesome sentiment.
This is gonna be a little bit off track, but I've got a high schooler that's getting ready to go to college and he's gonna call out. He played travel soccer and he's also a good athlete in kayaking. He tried out for the U.S. team last summer and did real well. But and he's around all these other people that are sort of on that track too, all these other kids. And a lot of them are motivated, like you say, to play in college, soccer or whatever. But now the reality is they are starting to figure out there's a huge cost to doing that, to commit themselves to play college sport. And I can't imagine trying to be an Olympic athlete, the cost of it there.
Right.
Time, relationships, and development, careers, and everything else. And so they're all, and it's pretty blunt, from the coaches. If you're going to play here, it's going to be a full-time job.
Yeah.
You're not going to have the college experience that the other kids have.
Right.
And so it's shocking for those kids. They weren't prepared for that. They thought that was it. You're done. You're good.
Right.
So, as parents, I'm wondering how we should be encouraging them along the way. Should we be encouraging them to be Olympic athletes, even if they have the talent and skill? With the cost, is it worth it? You see all these Olympic athletes. Is it worth it in general?
I think that's a super individualistic question, and I think, as I've already said, I think you take your child's lead. If your child is really passionate about that and wants to play the sport in college, by all means, do what it takes to help him or her get into that. But I think it's important to inform them about what it's going to be like. There are plenty of athletes I work with in Division I schools that are crying because they can't get their homework done. They don't have much of a social life, and they're, in basketball, they're burned out by December. And I'm not working with Duke or with Syracuse. I'm just talking about kind of your middle of the road players. They're getting scholarships, they're getting paid to play. But remember, what that also does is it changes a lot of times the intrinsic motivation, and it shifts it towards that extrinsic motivation, so that they begin to play to protect their scholarship. And the coaches can then lord that over the player's head, is if you aren't fully committed, I'm going to pull that. And that's a lot of pressure for an 18-year-old. So I think we do need to make the kids aware that if they commit to high-level college sports, that may well happen. Now, you can also choose a different path. You can play at Division III, or you can play at NAIA, or whatever. There's lots of different ways to do it. Or you can do like I did, which was I was intramural king. I decided to play I tried to get every intramural T-shirt that I could get. So inner tube water polo team, we won.
Do you have a room at
Table
home
tennis,
with all your
bowling,
shirts?
I've got them all. I didn't get a scholarship, but Duke only cost $12,000 a year back then.
I'm not sure about
55 now.
any other questions I have.
I'm sorry, I've
Take
gone
on.
too
No,
long.
this has been fantastic. Any other questions from the parents? And I'd like to ask one more question. I
Just constantly think about fundamentals and the importance of fundamentals as you watch basketball move
Yeah.
into this showboat game.
Right.
And I hear, I don't know, I don't follow it too much, but the Americans have lost the fundamentals. We just want to do this alley-oop showboat thing, where the Europeans are getting recruited more for pros because we've lost the fundamentals. And I think that's a good message. I don't think with any sport you can lose the value of the fundamentals.
Well, what's interesting about that is that the fundamentals are the easy thing to work on, actually. I mean, you can be...
But you can't stop doing it along the way.
Right. But so a lot of, like when I'm working with basketball players, I'll say, well, while you're studying, take a tennis ball and just bounce it the whole time while you're studying. I mean, that's something simple to do that works on a skill that is a fundamental skill. And then get really good training on your footwork. And so, yeah, the slam dunk is awesome. But,
It's beautiful, yeah.
but there's not a lot of work on that, right?
Right.
If you've got that skill to be able to do that, you
Yeah.
can do it. I think student athletes are still working on a lot of fundamentals, and that might be a little bit of an
The basketball.
overstatement is that we've lost that. I think really good coaches still know that that's what they gotta do.
So I had a conversation with a parent last year regarding strictly outcome. And the conversation went as such. My child, who was a lower school parent, we drove way down, and it's been eye-opening for many of us because we see, you mentioned the professionalization of sport, but what used to be strictly at the middle school level.
May I have your attention, please? Internet service has been fully restored on campus.
Yeah.
We now have internet on campus. Thank you for your
But
patience.
we've seen that now really dive down into kids who are immature, like 6, 7, 8 years old. And a parent said to me, he said, well, you know, their first grade team wasn't very successful last year. And as a result, and this was an honest to goodness conversation, as a result, is that I am confident that they're not going to be successful as adults because they don't know how to win. And that was a really hard conversation because, you know, one, I was just taken aback by that kind of, you know, that kind of forward thinking, if you will. But secondly, is because I wasn't equipped to answer that. Are there any studies out there that indicate success at an early age? I'm not talking about prodigies with chess or whatever, maybe, but success on a team at an early age, or non-successful teams, will impact their ability as adults to achieve greatness or, you know, become a physician or a professor. And I'm really interested in that because there may be, you know, Pat Conroy, I think, you know, talks about going over whatever and the impact on that and his experience. Michael Lewis, I think when he was a prep player at some school in New Orleans, about their coach and their success or lack thereof and how that impacted him moving forward. But I'd just like to be directed, if it's possible, into how to equip myself and understand. But I think it's a great conversation for us too.
Yeah.
Because look, it's about there's an outcome there, and the process understands that the process begins perhaps in first grade in Carolina Day uniform when you learn these skills. And so it's just a hard conversation.
Right.
So
I don't know of any studies that look at like win-loss records of first and second graders and long-term impact. I would suspect that the correlation would be pretty low, if not zero. The studies that are somewhat relevant have to do more with the studies that look at how a lot of times elite athletes will look back at moments of adversity and talk about learning to overcome those and having support in overcoming those, and that they identify those as crucial moments in their lives. And very rarely do they identify, well, it was the season that we went 22-0 that was the turning point in my career. Right? It's usually about seeing that they can overcome adversity. So I would look at those studies a little bit more. But I don't think there's any data on a win-loss record related to. And that seems like a pretty narrow view.
Agreed.
Yes.
Yeah. But that's what seems to be controlling how the things.
I have a question along those lines. What about if you have, as you move on to lower schools and middle school and high school, you know, you have, to me, in athletics, there's a value in seeing better kids or seeing how you get better and motivating all levels of athletes to get better.
Sure.
So is there a value in having, for example, if you have different teams, if you have, like we said here, different teams in middle school or in the sixth grade or whatever, and having a team with a more talent here and having the next level see what to look forward to and developing your skills and your talent to be able to move up to the next level. In athletics, is there value to that?
Seems like it. I mean, that to me seems like a pretty appropriate interpretation of that. That you would use upper level school as the model and as something to shoot for. Those of you that have kids in middle school, I'm sure at some point they want to play for the varsity, right? And do they go to the varsity games? Do they watch them and say, "Wow, one day I'll be on that team"? I mean, I think it's motivational. I think to see, because you see a higher skill level, and you want to be a part of that. And I think our job as parents and coaches is to say, well, how do you get to that? Right? It's not through wishful thinking. It's through that deliberate daily goal setting and practice. And,
Yeah, I think what Brenda said, too, is say you had 20 middle school kids,
Yeah.
and there's a whole spectrum of them.
Right.
Is it more useful, and I guess it's kind of what your outcome was, what you choose as your outcome. But do you take the top 10 and the bottom 10 and have 2 different teams, or do you mix them? And which one do all the kids
Right.
benefit from most?
That's a good
So it
question.
sounds like if you're talking about the outcome, if you're trying to win, obviously you separate them out, you're
Right.
the lower, but if the coach is good enough to create those opportunities for the top ones to be leaders and all those things that you're talking about.
And by the way, that's an issue that's discussed here
Yeah, it's just
constantly.
I mean, that's a much more real one about then how it is to get the elite athletes. Because wonderful the message is about grit, but I mean, it takes a good coach and a lot of intention on the coach's part, which is hard for anyone when you just get a little bit of their time to create those learning opportunities for all
Yeah,
of them.
well, I don't think it matters as much whether you have the top 10 and the next 10, as much as it matters about the philosophy that you have within those teams. And by that I mean that every player sees her role as vital to that team. Whether you're on the JV, the varsity, I don't know what all your levels are here, but the example I think of is like when you make it to college and you've been this awesome player and you're recruited by a big time school and you never play in a game, right? That's going to be really a frustrating situation for that player until you begin to help that player see the vital role that they play in practice on a daily basis. And so it's hard not to play in games, especially if the focus is on the games, as that's the most important part of our season. But if the coach is good, we'll talk about the season encompasses games, but it also encompasses all of the time that we're spending together outside of games. In fact, you're going to learn way more in the practices than you are going to learn in the games. So I think as long as you make each player aware of her specific role on the team, no matter where she is, that becomes ultra important. There's a really good story about, and I'm going to forget the player's name, but this was on an NFL team, a football team, that the coach said, we're getting ready to play X team, and this team has the best defensive end in the country, and he's going to destroy our quarterback. And so your job as a defensive player, even though you're not going to play because you're our 52nd player, is to study film of this guy and emulate him as best you can every single play. And so what happens is that kid ends up simulating this all-pro defensive end and wreaks havoc with his own offense and teaches them how to deal with that. And then the outcome, surprisingly, is he becomes all-pro as either a rookie or in his first year. And I wish I could remember the details. But it's this true story of like, if you don't think about whether you're starting or not, and you just focus on what your role is as a player, and that's the hard part, I think, with, say, a sixth grader, is because he or she is going to see like being an integral part of the winning team as key to success. And it's our job as parents and coaches is to say that success isn't defined by how many minutes you play. It's defined by the amount of effort that you put out and your attitude every single time that you go out. So what is the one thing that you're in control of 100% of the time? That's your attitude. So if you sulk on the bench and you're just at the end of the bench and you're not watching, right? Because you think you should be out there and you're not, that's a problem. And that's an area for a strong amount of growth that I think can transcend sports, and that's the beauty of it, is because not everybody's going to be the star.
That's exactly the language that we all need to use. You know, that's kind of words and stuff.
I think there's a lot of good data on that in psychology about growth and about focusing on embracing your role fully, and not defining yourself by some kind of external criterion, right? Like, where do we teach? Carol and I teach at Warren Wilson College. This is not, a national college of a research one institution. Both of us came from those types. She went to Columbia and I was at Duke. But we chose Warren Wilson because of its mission, and we see our role within that. If we define ourselves as compared to what our peers are doing, or how much money they're making, that could get a little frustrating. So when I think about my brother who teaches at Williams College, where they have quite a lot more money, that's not good for me. So I don't do that. I have to think about who am I reaching every day? What am I doing every day to become a better teacher? What opportunities am I granted by my friends to come out and meet new people and talk about this? And my message, you don't have to buy it. I mean, I just giving you that there's these different approaches. Both of them can lead to success, but approach one, my experience is that the kids go through a tremendous amount of stress with that. It's not that they can't reach the top. I mean, Kobe and Michael Jordan reached the top, but Michael Jordan is not the most pleasant guy to be around. If y'all read about it. And that's not to slam on a Tar Heel. It's just his idea of...
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
His idea of participation was to destroy his opposition. I really don't want my kids to do that. I really don't. That's personal. I do not want my kids playing to destroy other people. I want them to go out and see themselves achieve and get better every single time. Now, I loved winning the 100 fly, and I loved beating people. That was fun. But what was more fun was hearing from Eddie Reese, the UT coach, when he watched my film. He said, "You look like Nurity Maher, who was one of the best butterfliers ever." I was like, that's what I want to know, is that I've got a good stroke.